Welcome back to week 5 of Fit with Mitch. Send strength and conditioning coach Mitch Freeburn here. On this week's episode, we're going to talk about the rotational qualities of hockey and how we can improve that and actively work around it to improve what we can put out onto the ice. When thinking about the on-ice component, a huge ability and proficiency our players have to have is the ability to rotate on top of their hips and through their trunk. You think about on the ice, what are common skills? Skating, pivoting, change of direction, shooting, passing, reacting. All of these skills have one common goal, and that's the ability you have to be able to react and in some form rotate on sometimes a fixed pelvis, sometimes a neutral pelvis, and sometimes a very dynamic motion. So now, how do we build on that? There is a multiple different ways, and then we can use our layer analogy to kind of break down what we want to discuss and what we want to actively work on. So our first component, we want to think about mobilizing, creating actual space within the tissue and impacting our ability to rotate and move through these ranges of motion. Once we get through and we can actually move, then we can start building strength around that joint and that tissue that we just mobilized. Then finally, once we've mobilized the tissue and added strength around that joint, we can then use our most practical application and start to apply power outputs, which is the flashy stuff that you see out on the ice every night when practice or game. Okay, so addressing the first layer of our onion of our rotational performance, we are going to start with the mobility aspect. Before we start to mobilize, we want to increase tissue length. I've showed multiple options before, so you can just resort back to previous episodes or go back to what you already know. We're trying to stretch and lengthen tissues to alleviate some of that tension that we have from our natural posture. Once we have done the stretch, we can then progress into a mobility drill. So the first two I'll show you here, one is rotational, and then one would be extension and flexion based, which I'll explain later. So your first setup with rotational, you're gonna go back into the ground, you're in a ground-based position. We're gonna start in what's called the child's pose. From here, we're gonna put one hand behind our back as if we're into a chicken wing. All we're gonna try and do is pretend there's a rope on my right shoulder pulling me up towards the roof, and I'm gonna try and open up and really rotate through all those individual sections of my spine to create a collective result of me hopefully opening my body up and face above where I was originally targeted. Moving into our second mobility drill, we think about our daily postures or even outside of the ice, sitting at a desk. We're hunched forward, our shoulders are very closed. So addressing this directly, we can target, basically it's an extension. What we're trying to do is we're trying to mobilize and get that spine and that tissue moving in the opposite direction where it's naturally accustomed to being. So we're in the same 4-point stance, and now all we're gonna do is we're gonna really round the spine and try and drive our belly button into the ground and really try and accentuate that almost upward C appearance of our spine, and then really blow the spine up into the sky, so then we're into our downward C. What we're trying to accomplish here is we're trying to get, again, those individual spinal segments to move collectively to create a new shape and to try and find that different varying length of flexion and extension. Progressing forward, moving on from our mobility and our tissue lengthening phase, we now want to add some form of strength component so then we can actively move throughout that range of motion we just created. How do we do that? We add some form of external load or resistance that the small supporting muscles of the spine have to work unanimously to create that movement in a rhythmic and efficient fashion. Where do we go from here? For me, I'm going to use an Anchor. Just provides a basic constant resistance similar to the Kaiser that we've shown in previous episodes. For this example, I'm going to be on all fours. The Anchor is going to be trying to pull me where it's anchored. So now addressing the T-spine, I'm going to drop my shoulder, let my spine rotate towards that point of fixation, and from there I'm now going to contract and I'm going to try and rotate my way out creating strength and requiring the muscles to then fight against that resistance and create motion. As I go back down, I'm going to control my way back in, so that way I'm not just letting my body fall back to its position. I'm controlling the entire range, and I'm controlling the opening and closing movement. Moving into our final and most complex version to utilize that range of motion, that rotational ability that we're talking about in this episode, I'm going to be utilizing a med ball. We want to think about hockey like I mentioned before. There's instances on the ice such as a face-off where we have a fixed pelvis. We're stationary on the ice and we're forced to create power and strength rotationally. In other versions, while you're skating or moving dynamically, you have to do these same things, but the body is simply in motion. For the sake of this episode, I'll show you a power output from a static position, and then we can then apply that to on the ice, in-game situations, practice drills, what have you. Now, what does this drill physically look like? So I want you to think about our skater stance that we've talked about previously. Where does our power come from? Our power comes when we're nice and low. So for this drill, we're going to set up in the same stance. Med ball is going to be tight through the body. And all we're going to do is simply, with that fixed pelvis, we are going to rotate through and provide as much rotational power and output into that ball to wherever we're directing it. So now what does that practically look like? So like I said, nice low stance, solid hips where our power comes from. Ball out in front, we're going to preload and then rotate on top of our hips as fast and as hard as we can. Just as a final collection to put all our thoughts and tie up this episode. Again, we started with mobilizing tissues. We're creating range of motion and teaching an athlete, if they've never done it before, how to physically rotate throughout those individual segments of your spine to create a collective result of opening and closing where your torso is orientated. Then we progressed into providing strength and building output around that range of motion we just gained. So I showed you on the Anchor, we're resisting that external load and producing force to then shorten and lengthen based on where that anchor is and where it's trying to direct our body. Then the final piece of our onion, once they have got the mobility, they've got the strength, we can then focus on the output side, which is the functional, the powerful, where the shot comes from in our analogy for a hockey player. From there, we think about the characteristics of our sport. We're rotational, anti-rotational. You can keep getting more and more in depth and provide more examples than I've just given today. So I hope you learned something from today's episode and you can start to build some form of rotational component into your daily life or training. Stay tuned for next week of Fit with Mitch.